everyone. I think with the quieting of the music, it's my turn to introduce myself once more. I'm Giles Whittell, an editor at Tortoise, and my job right now is to introduce our final session. Thank you for those who've come. Thank you very much to those who have stuck with us all day. This, in a sense, is the big one. What will the world look like after COVID? The reason we didn't have any slides up while we were waiting to start is that we don't know the answer to that question. The session is going to be chaired by Ivo Dolder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, with Gail Smith, president and CEO of the One Campaign, and a former administrator of the US Agency for International Development under the Obama administration. And in a sense, in their crosshairs, Lisa Nandy, Shadow Secretary of State here in the UK, with the no pressure task of reconceiving the world on behalf of the opposition, and that is the Labour Party, and probably a good half of UK voters in a time of COVID, and trying to imagine what position the UK will have in that world post-Brexit. So without more ado, I think if anyone can plot a future, hopeful or otherwise in these circumstances, it's these three. So over to you, Ivo.
Well, Giles, thanks so much. And it's wonderful to be here. It's been a terrific day so far. And I'm so pleased to be able to sit with Gail and Lisa and, basically solve the rest of the world. Well, we got 45 minutes to do it, which is probably 40 minutes more than we need. No, seriously, it's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful for the council to be a partner with Tortoise Media and others. So thanks so much for the opportunity. Let's, Gail and Lisa, thanks so much for joining us. Let's have a sort of a stage setter. When I look at where we are, I don't think that I've seen anything like this in my lifetime. The worst pandemic in a century, an economic crisis that reminds us of the 1930s, a political crisis that seems to affect all of our democracies, an international order that is really being shaken up. Gail, starting with you, if you had to sort of summarize the state of the world, where are we today? And what is the nature of the crisis, then I think we can start having a conversation about what do we do about it.
Thanks, Ivo, and hi to Lisa. And Ivo, it's great to see you again. We go way back. Look, I think what we're looking at is fragmentation aided by utterly failed leadership. You rightly say, we're looking at something we've never seen in our lifetimes. I have never seen a circumstance where the consequences were even half as dire as they are now, where global leadership has failed to come up, failed to step up, failed to act. And I think there are a few things that are at the core of that I would just throw out, because maybe on the other side of those, there's some thinking we can do about, so what do you do about it? The first is, I think we have realized not only that our multilateral institutions and system was weakening and faltering a bit, but that it clearly was overly dependent on some countries. I think with the withdrawal of the US basically from the spirit and intention of multilateralism, I would argue the distraction of the UK, the pillars, or some of the key pillars, have opted out. And the world's great powers, if you think of the US, China, and Russia, they're not using that system to solve problems, they're using that to disrupt it. So what is the dependence of the multilateral system on too few actors? How do we think about evening that out, and would that work? I think the second thing, and it's the thing I've really come to a high level of frustration about, is that I think our politicians, in addition to failing to lead, if your job is the health and security, economically and otherwise, of your own citizens, you are compelled to collaborate internationally, because that's the only way you can address a global economic crisis or a global pandemic. Their failure to do so, I think, is tied also to the failure of politicians to explain to educate, to advocate to citizens that this notion of global interdependence is not a choice, it's not a political position, it's a fact. And while many of them know that, I think they're unprepared to put in the political capital to make the case. It may be unpopular, but when and where we don't cooperate, if you imagine what the world's going to look like when a vaccine comes along, we've got two choices. We can either have a food fight over a vaccine and extend the lifespan of this pandemic, or countries can cooperate. But leaders have to lead and explain that to their citizens rather than doing the short-term fix of, let me satisfy you by showing you I'm just going for us.
That's great, and I think both of those pieces are really critical. The too few actors are there, and the unwillingness to make the case for the fact of interdependence. And maybe later on, I'll share some new data we have at the Council on Americans Think About Engagement, which is actually better than we often assume. But Lisa. Over to you. How would you, and wonderful to see you here, how would you describe the problem that we face today, the crisis that we have, so that we can have a baseline for all of us to figure out what we're going to do about it?
Well, I think it's worth saying, first of all, thank you to you and to Gail for having this discussion with me as well today. I mean, I've been in post now for about 150 days. And when I was offered the job as the Shadow Foreign Secretary, I hadn't quite appreciated that the world was about to fall almost completely apart within just a few days. So it's been quite a baptism of fire. But it's also felt like a very, very important moment to step into this world, because I think it's right to start from where you started, which is that this is just unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime. And this sort of moment we haven't seen before. Question is, what is it and what are we going to do about it? I think the world faces an enormous challenge, not least because of the rise of China and the way in which China now exerts enormous economic and therefore political might across the world and through those multilateral institutions, and the rising tensions with the United States, underpinned by an economic model pursued by China that has been at odds with the economics of the United States for the last few years. I think those rising tensions, which are amplified by two of what I would call strongmen leaders that have emerged in large numbers around the world, have caused us real problems. And for countries like the United Kingdom, we're essentially going through an identity crisis at the moment, having left the European Union, but with no clear direction of travel under the current government. It's been disastrous to see the tensions rising between those two global superpowers. Recently, we had a huge row in the British Parliament about Huawei and the role that Huawei plays in our 5G network, and the role that Chinese-backed companies should play in our critical infrastructure like nuclear power as well. Now, essentially, the UK has been squeezed in a trade war between the US and China, with serious implications for our national security, as well as our ability to speak from a position of independence. And it's become increasingly apparent that for countries like the United Kingdom, building alliances with other similar countries, whether that's France, Germany, Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, this is going to be increasingly important if we're going to deal with the rise of those two superpowers and the developments that we've seen in the last few years, particularly given that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And as Gail said, we're at a crossroads moment where the world can choose whether to support those multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization, whether to come together and pull together in order to ensure that we not only see equitable access to a vaccine, but we also deal with the global economic fallout that is already starting to unfold around the world, or we can choose to pull apart. And already you can see the non-progressive voices lining up on the other side of that, attacking international institutions, blaming migrants, closing borders, and pulling apart at the very moment that we need to come together. So I think there's a moment here for the world where we have to decide which side we're on. And then we have to start addressing the underlying causes of some of what's happened. And I absolutely agree with Gail about the critical role and the damage that some of those leaders that we currently have are doing. But my view is that leaders are often as much symptoms of changes in public opinion as they are the cause. And if you look at what's happened in Britain with Brexit, or you look at the support for Donald Trump in America, I think there are some very similar drivers behind that of people who, for a very long time, have seen that the system isn't working, are looking to progressive political leaders for answers, and for too long have found none. So for me, this is a wake-up call for those of us who would see ourselves on the progressive side of politics, that we have to rebuild those institutions so that they're anchored in the interests of working people around the world. And we need to bring them much closer to people so that they're far more understandable, far more accountable, far more responsive to the real challenges in people's lives.
So I think we've got both some agreement, particularly on the question of leaders and and what they need to do within their own countries and how to mobilize their own publics and speak to their own publics in order to make that possible. But I think we've also come to a really big dilemma. And there are two things that are true in both what Lisa said and what Gail said. It's true that we need more countries to step up to lead the international, lead reform and make effective the international institutions we have to deal with the global problems that we have. We need to bring more people together. And at the same time, it is also true that the world is increasingly divided, divided between democratic and non-democratic leaders, divided between the United States and China, a Chinese vision of the world and a non-Chinese vision of the world. In some ways, divided between the United States and its former allies. Actually, they're still allies as far as I can tell. So I shouldn't push that too far. And its allies, a division among big powers and middle powers. And so I think the fundamental question, Gail, and jump in here, is how do we bring the various parties together that need to be gotten together in order to deal with the problems? How do you solve the pandemic without the United States and China working together, for example? How do you do that when the need is so evident and yet the competition politically at the strategic level and in other ways is becoming worse and worse?
I'm sure I can fix that in about 30 seconds, Eva. A couple things on that. I mean, look, and I think the arrival of a vaccine, hopefully vaccines, is a really good case in point or illustration of how to think about this. So if what we need to do is compel leaders to cooperate on global vaccine distribution, allocation, ultimately equity, what are the things that could make that happen? One is oftentimes it only takes one or two or three leaders who are willing to step up and take the lead on that. Now, I realize, and many times that's been the US, it's not always exclusively the US. So one is, how do we get a cohort of leaders who are willing to get out there big and push on this? We've got some of the pieces of that, quite frankly. We have seen some leadership on this, not sufficient. The second is, how do we convey to the public, to the media, including, and also those politicians who are holding up progress, the cost of doing vaccines the way we've done PPE globally, which has been inefficient, ineffective, and again, ultimately extended the reach of the virus rather than shortening it, as opposed to a strategic, science-based approach to vaccines. I think the more we can quantify that and say, would you like a pandemic that lasts for 4 years or a pandemic that lasts for 2 years? I don't know what those time periods are, but there's a vast difference between managing it based on the science and epidemiology and cooperatively and just having a free-for-all. So the second is, how do we get that information out there in a meaningful way? And I think the third, and in many ways the most important, but the hardest, is how do we compel our leaders to just be quiet and do the right thing? Obviously, there's one way to do that. Voting really, really matters. But I think we've also seen, if you look at, particularly in the US, but I think this is spread around the world, the power of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is that citizens have said, enough, we're done. We're not doing this anymore. Here's what we expect. And we're not going to stop until we start getting some serious traction. We do have evidence that citizens can compel their leaders to act. So I think we got to work on all three of those things: finding a coalition of the willing, building and supporting it. Second, bringing facts and evidence to the case. There's such a strong, indisputable case for doing vaccines the right way and saving lives and money. And then third, all of us got to get up out of our chairs and out there constantly make clear that this just isn't good enough, because it's not.
That's great. Lisa, I'll come back to you. Iniola Price has joined us. He had a question or a comment. So why don't we bring you in, Iniola, just to see how you want to help us out to solve these problems. Maybe you got the answer.
All right. I quite agree there with Gail that we need to compel our leaders to fix this problem. And I think Edward in earlier session made the point that everybody is individualistic right now. Everybody is maintaining the nationalism path. And everybody's, oh, I want to do this so that my country will be praised above all other countries. And that is a big problem. We need to work together. I wonder why the men, in quotes, the male leaders in the world right now are not looking or are not asking the female leaders how they did it, because data has shown that female leaders coped well with the pandemic. Female-led countries coped well with pandemic. So why are the men not asking the question, how did you do it, so that we can implement it, we can bring it to our climb and make better decisions? Why is everybody in their own shell trying to fix the problem when you can as well ask your neighbor for the solution and you will get a solution? Then I want Gail Smith to dive deeper into how citizens can effectively compel their leaders. I know she had said a lot about that, but I need more information, because I think that's the way.
That's great. That's great, Lisa. How do we get more Jacinda Ardern's running for and running our governments, or even Angela Merkel's? It is true, as Iniola says, that women leaders have, if you plot effectiveness and leadership, there is a real close correlation, if not a causation, between that. What is it in women leaders?
Iniola is now my favorite person that I've Zoomed with recently. And I really like the question. I will answer it, but I want to sort of start somewhere else, which was sort of where Gail left off, because this question about how you deal with the complexity of the situation at the moment, I think is really important. Often in Britain, the situation between China and the United States in our debates is likened to the Cold War. I think it's far more complex than that, because as you alluded to, there's no way of solving the major challenges we face, whether that's COVID-19 or climate change, without the engagement of both the US and China. And it's not entirely straightforward, because although countries like the UK are currently, and rightly, at loggerheads with China over issues like Hong Kong, democracy, the rule of law, the treatment of the Uyghur people, we also find in them more of an alliance around issues like climate change than we do with the current US administration, at least at federal level. So there's a big challenge for us, and I think the answer is essentially two pillars. It's one, constructive engagement, and two, strategic independence. And the thing that the UK really lacks at the moment, and many countries lack, is far greater strategic independence. We're seeking a trade deal with the United States, which has meant that our government has been curiously silent in the face of all sorts of things recently, including the Black Lives Matters protests. But we're also looking to China to help us rebuild after COVID in the economy. And for that reason, there's a real tension at the heart of government. That's why the debates around issues like Huawei and who controls our national security infrastructure really, really matters to us. And it matters to many other of those countries that Gail talked about, who will need to step up to help resolve this in these coalitions of the willing. And that's why we've really, really got to resolve that before we can start to think about how we hold those countries to account and we bring them into the global system. And that sort of brings me to Eniola's point about leadership, because, you know, I think the reason, the thing that gives me hope in all of this is that I think people are much smarter, much better, much more aware than the political classes give them credit for. We've just been through this really divisive time in Britain over the last 4 years, where we've been endlessly talking about Brexit, and we've pretty much divided the population in half and been rude about both of them, characterising people as Remainers or Leavers on one side or the other, and arguing that people are just too stupid to understand what's happening, too out of touch to care. Actually, across that divide, what is starting to emerge is a population that do see Britain's role in the world as being very connected to other countries, our fates intrinsically linked, do believe that Britain has to give as well as take and shed light as much as show might in the world. Our political leaders largely don't understand that at the moment, and that is part of the problem. So if you want to really change things, then there are lots of ways to do it. One is to get involved in this debate, which is largely the preserve of older white men, and more diversity in this area would be very welcome. The other is to vote. It's no surprise to me that the two most popular politicians, the politicians in Britain that people think have handled this crisis best, are Angela Merkel and Jacinda Ardern. And that goes back to leadership and the type of leadership that the public want. Well, if you want that leadership, you have to vote for it. And that's one of the best ways that you can make change happen.
Gail, I'm going to come to you in answering Eniola's question. How do you mobilize citizens in the right way to get the right kind of leadership? I also want to bring in Ali Borhani, who has his hand raised. We'll get back to Ali after Gail. And then let me also, go ahead, Gail.
I'll just be very quick in terms of my sense of what I actually think works. I think when you give people information and then empower them to be activists, I don't think we have to orchestrate every move, give people the tools. But a couple things I think really work if you're trying to compel political leaders. One is persistence. Quite frankly, the one-off big marches that we often see around the world, those get headlines for maybe a day or maybe not even headlines. But then they fade away. They don't really have that much impact. It's the persistence of civil activism that gets the attention of politicians. The second thing that gets their attention is strange bedfellows or diverse coalitions. They are expecting to hear certain points of view from certain groups of people. When they are confronted with a group of people that it includes maybe different political perspectives, different parts of a country, different kinds of jobs, different ethnicities, different religions, it gets their attention. Because the way politicians win is that they vie for certain constituencies. And if they know that people are crossing lines to work together on issues, totally gets their attention. So put tools in the hands of activists and advocates, persistent, not just the big one-off march. And then I think the third is really diverse coalitions really make a difference.
All good, all great point. I mentioned earlier that the Chicago Council on Global Affairs every year does a major opinion poll to look what Americans think about foreign policy. Next week we'll release the results of our poll, but just as a preview, we wanted to dig deep into the question: does the pandemic change America's view about whether we should engage the world? And the answer is yes, we need to continue to engage the world. Overwhelmingly, Americans believe, and this is across the board, Democrats, Republicans of all kinds, that the U.S. playing an active role in world affairs is a good thing for the United States, and staying out of world affairs is not a good thing. They believe that globalization, this is to Gail's point, is something that is good for the United States. They believe that trade is good for creating jobs and good for the United States. They believe in alliances with our closest allies. Here's a really important statistic. 73% of Americans think that we should work and make decisions with our allies, even if that means we don't get our way. That's a pretty strong sentiment of wanting to work together with other countries. And it's leaders not believing that Americans want to be involved in the world that may be more of the problem than the Americans themselves. Often, as Lisa, no doubt you know, the public is often smarter than the people who they put in office. Let me go to Ali right now and ask him to join this conversation. Ali, wonderful to have you.
Thank you, Ivo. Thank you, Gail and Nandi. First of all, I had moments of goosebumps and chill when you used the coalition of the willing. The last time we heard that term, we went to Iraq. So I hope that we're talking about the new coalition on that front. And thanks to Giles. Yes. Yeah, and thanks to Giles and to Tortoise, I think we need to think in about the definition of leadership, because we use this term and we need a new definition as to what leadership should look like in the era we're living. And one of the handicaps I see is the lack of interest in understanding other cultures. The basic about dealing with certain cultures in Eurasia and Asia Pacific is sandwiching criticism between two complements. And what we see is coming from US to China is why Jacob Blake has been shot 7 times in front of his children and handcuffed to a bed in hospital. US is lecturing China why some people in certain circumstances are handcuffed. Both are wrong, but it's very hard to convince China when these issues are simmering up. And I have a question for Nandi. With Eurasian tent, US tent, and EU tent, where is UK going to balance its future being out of 3 tents in such a conflicting economic, socio political dilemma? And what are your recommendations as Labour into, if you tomorrow you're the foreign minister, how will you balance these 3? Thank you.
Lisa, why don't you answer that question and sort of think about, you mentioned the importance of diversity in leadership as part of that. How does the UK play its particular role in these 3 different, where are they going to align, or should they align with, but also how do you bring that diversity in it? And then we'll bring in Joshua Russell for his question.
And well, I suppose in terms of the diversity issue, I think there's something really important that Ali just said about not understanding other cultures, or not, you know, even worse, not wanting to understand other cultures. And the way in which we've lost the ability to understand one another, I think, is one of the great challenges of our political times that exists within countries as well as between countries. And starting to rebuild that understanding requires a completely different political culture from the one that we've allowed to grow up in recent years, one that is respectful, curious, interested, kind, that listens more than it talks, and tells the truth. And none of those things are true about our political culture at a global level or at a UK level at the moment. So there is definitely a lot of work to do. And I think in many ways it's a generational issue, that there are a new generation of leaders that are battling to come to the fore across the world. And that generation is going to have to pick up the baton and make sure that we change this. I was so struck by Gail's point about how politicians respond to very diverse coalitions. I mean, as somebody who now is, you know, trying to get politicians to respond, it strikes me that's such a you know, an insightful way to look at it. Something that's, for someone who's on the inside being lobbied myself, you don't really realise, but you know it when it's true. And it is absolutely true that when those voices are diverse, when they're surprising, you pick up your head and you listen, and you start to move. So I think that's really important. And part of the way I think you build a different political culture as well is that you change the people in the room. And that is, I think, part of the problem. I've been very struck by the fact that in the last 150 days, I've met many people had many fascinating conversations, but the overwhelming majority of them are with people who helped to build the system that we currently have. Now, there's great strength in that, there's great experience, but there are also real problems with the system that we currently have, and we need far more voices in the room making decisions about how we move forward, who see the problems inherent in that and want to see the system change. And I'll just say this as well in relation to the specific question about where the UK is going to exert influence in the world, where we're going to find alliances. Traditionally, the way that the UK has managed to go out and have impact has been in three spheres: the Commonwealth, Europe, and the United States. And you're right to say, I think, that in various ways and for various reasons, our alliances, our influence, our ability to operate in those arenas has diminished in recent years. We've gained a reputation as an alliance breaker rather than an alliance maker. And for all the talk of global Britain here in the UK, when the world looks at us, they often see a country that is behaving in precisely the opposite way. In the last 24 hours, we've been dominated here by a debate about whether the government is right to say that they're going to break international law and go back on the commitments that they made to the European Union. And it is causing consternation across the political process and across the world. So there is a huge job of work to do, I think, to repair some of the damage that we've done. My own view is that all of those spheres matter to us, and that if you look at some of the rising powers, we've talked about China and the US, we haven't mentioned India yet, but obviously our relationship with India is important for historical reasons, but also if you look at what happened during the COVID crisis, India was one of the first countries we reached out to when we were short of medicine, key medicine like paracetamol, PPE and other equipment that we needed. So these relationships are very important to us. But Europe will always be a very close ally and incredibly important to the United Kingdom because geography matters. And you saw it when we had the Novichok poisonings on the streets of Salisbury, that the first place that the then Prime Minister Theresa May reached to was the European Union for help and support when she expelled Russian diplomats. Those alliances are going to continue to be really important to us. I think there is a willingness to try and rebuild some of that across Europe. I think we've tested people's patience almost to destruction, but it is still there. And I think with a bit of will, we could start to rebuild some of those alliances. But the way, you know, the basis on which those friendships are built, those partnerships are built, has to be one that recognises both sides. And so in the recent years, I don't think the UK has projected that sense at all, that sense of respect, of partnership, of wanting to spread light, not just might, across the world. And that's something that I am determined that we in the Labour Party are going to start to restore to our political narrative here.
Thanks, Lisa. That's I think all extraordinarily well put, and it makes relevant a comment in the chat function from Neola on the importance of trust and the fact that without trust the system breaks down. With trust you can do a lot, and it seems to me that both the UK and the US have a trust deficit when it comes to the rest of the world, and rebuilding that trust, rebuilding confidence and commitments is going to be the most important way in which we can start the process of resolving the questions set before us. Joshua Russell's been wanting to jump in, so Joshua, jump.
Hello. So I'm a long-standing Labour member. I've been a Labour member since I was 16. I have campaigned at every election. I quit my job in 2015 to campaign for Luke Pollard. And I last spoke to you, Lisa, at the Labour Policy Forum, where I got to demand that we say never again to the situation in which we got into this pandemic. We've heard a lot today in support of Germany and New Zealand and their response to the pandemic. It is no coincidence that they have much more representative forms of elections and much more representative electoral systems. So my question for you, Lisa, is do you think our country would have handled the pandemic and handled Brexit so very poorly if we had had a more representative electoral system?
I think that's actually a relevant question for Gail too, in a different way. So I'm going to come to you on that too, Gail.
Okay.
Lisa,
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I was being polite and waiting for Gail, but yes. Thanks so much for that question, Joshua. Because, and I'm gonna try and answer it very directly, but I do think this is quite complex. So I literally wrote a book about this issue with Caroline Lucas, who was then the leader of the Green Party here in Britain, and with a Liberal Democrat called Chris Bowers, because my own view about the political culture is it is better for having broader representation, and the level of challenge that different political traditions pose to one another helps us, not hinders us from getting to the right place and making the right decisions in relation to the broadest number of people. And we explored different ways in which you can bring in a more plural form of electoral system. And we didn't quite reach a conclusion about which of those we supported. And the reason for that was because my concern about many forms of proportional representation is that rather than forcing political parties and different political traditions to work together, often they allow people to move into their own silos and plant their flag in the sand and say, I'm here and you either come to me or you don't. I really felt it during Brexit. That, I mean, Labour didn't manage to achieve a consensus within the Labour Party, but one of the things that really struck me about that was that we were having to go home to our constituencies in very different parts of the country, hearing very, very different messages from people across Britain. You know, Luke Pollard, for example, who you said you campaigned for, he was hearing a very, very different message back home about Brexit than I was hearing in Wigan. And then we were having to come to Westminster and debate that out and try and find a consensus in the middle. And I think that is the thing that is really, really important. There are forms of PR that I think help to aid progressive cooperation and that are important. I'd love to see some of those trialled at our, on a regional basis. For example, we've got mayors where we would really benefit, I think, from having, where you've got assemblies, we'd really benefit from having a more diverse set of representation. But ultimately, I think that the political culture is the problem. And the political culture that had grown up within the Labour Party in recent years was the thing that stopped us from reaching some kind of consensus, from understanding one another, from listening to different parts of our coalition and bringing those interests together. And I think the political culture in Britain is really the problem. I want to see a progressive government with a very open approach to listening to different parts of the country, listening to different points of view, listening to different political traditions, and doing what we can to bring people with us. Because in the end, that is the way that you build lasting political change. And it's why I have huge amounts of respect for the One campaign and some of the people on this call, because if you don't build a consensus out there in the country, you can force things through Parliament and they last weeks when the next coalition or administration takes over.
Gail, talk both a little bit about how political polarization in the United States makes leadership globally more difficult, and how one might be able to overcome this, and the deep division that we see in not only in Washington, by the way, in our new opinion poll. The other thing is Democrats and Republicans have a completely different worldview. So this deep division has a problem, and whether it is changes that we could bring about to make that happen. But also, I want to get, and we're getting towards the end, I also want to hear you about, if you were back in charge, how would you try to rebuild that global coalition to deal with the questions that we have been talking about before?
Yeah, for everybody's reference, I was like in charge of everything. But a couple things on that, Evo. I think our division is so sharp that it's very difficult to find those things in the middle that people can agree on. I think there are a few things we need to do to overcome that. One is figure out some ways we can be operating with the same set of facts. I think we all know that one of our problems is that somebody comes into the room and insists on one set of facts, somebody another. There have to be a subset of issues where we can agree on the same facts. Usually those are around things like kids and education. But what are the things people care enough about? That's number one. I think number two, there are a handful of things that still generate what we would in the US call bipartisan support, the support of both parties. And it's quite surprising. If you had told me 15 or 20 years ago that foreign aid or international funding to fight HIV and AIDS would be something Democrats and Republicans would strenuously agree on, even now when they can barely agree on what day of the week it is, I would have told you you were hallucinating. But the fact of the matter is there's really strong agreement on that. So how do you take that and build on it? And it's incremental and it's hard and it's a step at a time. I think the third thing is that we're seeing much more cooperation, even where people sometimes want to hide it. And even though we're also seeing differences, though, at the local level than at the federal level. And one of the trends we're seeing globally is the rise of the importance of the mayor, the governor, the local leader. And I think not focusing entirely at the federal level on trying to stitch these things back together. If I was back in charge, Ivo, I think what I would do, I think about two things in terms of how we pull something called global leadership back together. One is identify the most common agreed on global threats, challenges, or opportunities of our lifetimes. Don't try to do everything. So obviously, pandemic, climate change, who knows what the third may be. But then the second is, think about doing it by putting together a slightly different coalition. We've heard a lot of comments here today. Why aren't we asking women leaders how they succeeded? All right, let's have more women leaders in that room. I said at the beginning, I believe it to be true that we've got such a disproportionate allocation of power within the multilateral system that if somebody opts out or gets sick, things turn on their heads. So what is the constellation of countries and leaders that are at the ground floor of trying to put this back together? And then I think the third is I would urge, demand, or otherwise request that we set ourselves up for tangible results and outcomes. I think part of what a lot of people around the world are reacting to, and Lisa's referred to this, is real disappointment. Things were promised and not delivered. What's the low-hanging fruit where the world can show if we work together, we can show you tangible results in quarters 1, 2, 3, and earn back the credibility with the public that is, I think, ultimately the foundation for that trust in the international system.
I'm conscious of time, Gail. That was great, and I want to go back to Giles in 1 second. But I also wanted to give Harry Moy an opportunity to just jump in here with his question. He's been very patient, waiting, having raised his hand. So why don't you jump in, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Ivo. First, I just want to say, Lisa, I previously, before the Labour leadership election, I'm a Labour member. I wasn't particularly familiar with you as an MP, but after the Labour leadership election, I was very pleased to see that you've become in such a high position in the party. My question for both Lisa and Gail is, we're seeing this massive rise of nationalism, and what's happening is I feel as though nationalism is becoming confused with patriotism, and so. To sort of take more of a British-centric viewpoint, personally, I think that the current situation with respect to refugees coming into the United Kingdom, I think that's a point of pride for the United Kingdom. I don't think that is something that we should be angry about. I think the fact that these people are in such a dire situation in their country and they're coming to the United Kingdom out of all countries is something that the UK should be proud of. How do we try and reframe the point of view so that actually patriotism is not synonymous with nationalism, but is actually patriotism means being a beacon across the rest of the world, that people in these terrible situations are able to look at us and want to come here, and that we as citizens of those countries can be proud of that fact instead of being so protectionist and so insular about it.
Great question, Harry, and I think actually is a nice way to end the conversation. Gail and Lisa, both starting with you, Gail, a quick reflection on the importance of patriotism and why it is not the same as nationalism.
Well, I think that's such a good question and such a good example. And what you really get to is, how do you get people to take pride in their country, their community, for what it's doing, for what it stands for, without it becoming a me first, right? And me only. I'm not sure I have the answer. I think telling people that story, I'll give you an example that's been very key for us at One and for me. The UK, through DFID, your development agency, which now no longer really exists, it's been merged into the Foreign Office. The pride that people of the UK should take in that is over the top. It's been a leader in there being a more stable, fair, and equitable world. It has been a leader in rigor and doing things right and doing things smart. It's been a leader and a beacon in the way you described with refugees. That story gets buried. I used to be a reporter, and I always found that the negative stories got much more traction than the positive ones. So I think part of it is we need to tell the story better of what are those things. I think the second is enable people ways to hear what the rest of the world thinks. I mean, how do you create a competition so you want to be the country that is the most generous to refugees? Harry, I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I will say what you've given me coming out of this is something quite important to think about, because there's a narrow line between nationalism and patriotism, and we need to do more on the latter side to counter, I think, the dangers we're seeing on the former.
It's great. Absolutely. Lisa, how do you?
Well, I think this is a great question to potentially end on, because I accept that difference between nationalism and patriotism. I think it hasn't been well understood in the political world, and something that's worth paying attention to. I think nationalism is divisive. It pulls people apart from one another, whereas patriotism brings people together in common cause. And I think nationalism, division, it thrives in a time of fear. And people are very anxious at the moment. Things are getting worse in the economy. We're expecting huge economic fallout from COVID, as well as the public health implications. And so it's no surprise to me that nationalism and populism, far-right activity, all these things are on the increase. And it's why I said that the world is at a crossroads where we have to decide which side we're on in the battle that is to come, about whether the world pulls together or whether we pull apart. Now, where is the hope? Well, I think the hope lies somewhere in your question, because this point about refugees, I used to work with child refugees before I came into politics, I think is absolutely right. The UK should be proud of what we've done in providing safe haven to refugees, and the fact that people want to come to the UK as well as to other countries around the world. And actually, I think that is something that is well understood by most of the public, that where people are fleeing persecution, where they're in desperate circumstances, the fact that we do our bit, that we play our part, that is incredibly important. And when we go out and we fly the pride flag on LGBT Rights Day, in our embassies across the world, in countries where LGBT rights are routinely abused and undermined, that makes me proud. That to me is Britain being patriotic and playing our part in the world and standing with the people of those countries to stand up for them. And I think that country does exist. I think it's been desperately underestimated by the political leaders that we have, and not well understood. And it's something that I think is incumbent on politicians like me and like the Labour Party to give voice to. It's what George Orwell, who wrote a lot about these things, called the country that lies beneath the surface, and it must be heard. Now, when I was standing in the leadership contest, and thank you for those kind comments, one of the things that I did was to sit down with Danny Boyle, who you'll know is a film director and also designed the opening ceremony of the 2012 London Olympic Games. That was the last time that I saw that progressive patriotic story about Britain being told, and it really did bring the country together, and it brought in all of those things about the role we've played in the world and how we've looked after one another and protected one another. And I asked him during the contest, when we sat down, where did that country go? Because within a few years it just felt like that whole settlement had fallen apart. And he said to me, it is there, but it is waiting for people to give voice to it. And that, for me, is not just the job of people like me, although I have a big platform and I have a responsibility to use it well, but that is the responsibility of all of us to give voice to that country. And as a politician, if I hear that clamour of noise, it makes it much easier for me to respond to it. So I've loved this conversation today because I think it's brought together all those constituent parts. And I really want to thank you for bringing us together at this moment. Somebody, Anthony Shifley, the former Australian Prime Minister, once said, Labour must be the light on the hill for people in times of darkness. Well, I think we all should. And these are really dark times, but there is light and we've got to find it.
Well, Lisa, that's a wonderful sentiment to end on, that there is light at not only at the end of the tunnel, but in the darkness. And it is about capturing the light, understanding where it is, and bringing everybody together to get there, that we're going to succeed. We may not have solved the great questions of the global order afterwards. It would have been too much to ask for 45 minutes, but we did get to a whole bunch of very important reflections. And Lisa and Gail, thank you so much for helping us get to that point, and to all of you who've participated in the chats and as well as by being part of the conversation. Thank you for guiding us to that direction. I'm going to hand it back to Giles. It's been a terrific day as far as I'm concerned. It's been really useful. It's been wonderful to work with all of you in partnership. And Giles, over to you.
Thanks, Ivo.
Thank you so much, Ivo. Thanks, Gail. Thank you, Lisa. I notice in the chat, Sharon's saying, I am more hopeful than before today. Me too, but one of the great things is, it's not just hope. I love the fact that Gail answered Eniola's question so specifically, especially as others have noticed, with the fact that diverse coalitions get people's attention. I have a picture in my mind already of a Venn diagram that I'm sure we're going to get Tortoise graphics people to produce to illustrate that, the sheer sort of mathematical logic of that. So thank you also to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, to the One Campaign, to Project Everyone. It's a cliche, but it's true. Today would not have been possible without your help. Thanks to everybody who's made it possible from within Tortoise, including my colleagues Steph, Harika, Tom, Sam, and my fellow editors. If you're curious about what we're doing at Tortoise, please go to our website, sign up for a free trial, and whether you are or not, simply by virtue of coming to all or part of today's proceedings, you will receive our SenseMaker daily newsletter, which I edit. I hope you enjoy it. I just want to take a couple of minutes to show that it's not just that we've been listening to each other, but others have too. Pascal Soriot's optimism, qualified optimism, way back at the beginning of the day, about the fact that there may be a vaccine from AstraZeneca by the end of this year, is already out there on the news wires. My notebook is absolutely full of underlined nuggets that I'm going to take away and digest, and we will bring some of them to you in some of our journalism. Julia Gillard, the former Australian PM, wins the award for understatement. A forward-leaning American president would be incredibly important, she said. Audrey Tang, the information minister from Taiwan, said, people who feel joy and humor can be vaccinated against rage. I could go on and on. Farah Pandit in the same session said, we've got a mainstream. And Anne Applebaum said, we're about to see an election campaign run entirely on the basis of a fake picture of the world. We had a great session on debt in which Nairi Woods said that a hangover from the 80s was the belief that poor people always use money badly. It's great to be able to consign that to 4 decades ago. And David Miliband said later on, politics are now in retreat to a network of fortresses. I believe he was quoting somebody else. Samantha Power, a couple of sessions ago, made the point that it is worth running the counterfactual. What if 2016 had panned out differently in the US election? Well, we can think about that for a long time. Over the course of 9 sessions today, we've come across many concrete ways that, absent seismic change in the leaders whom we democratically elect, there is scope for collaboration on vaccines, on debt, on food, on the UN SDGs. Some of the speakers have outlined existing cooperation, really important, between NGOs and UN agencies, NGOs including the One Campaign. And David Miliband made the point that the polylateral world is working together, even if the multilateral world isn't. But Lisa, right at the end, made the point that if you want a different sort of leadership, you've got to vote for it. And Ivo, citing the Chicago Council's own research, said 73% of Americans think we should be working with our allies, even if it means we, I'm reading my own shorthand here, we don't get our way. So grounds for hope, but above all, most important, immediate priority, if you're lucky enough to have a vote, use it next time the opportunity arises. And on that note, 3 minutes to 6. Thank you all again very much for making today possible. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks a lot.